bit about what your evaluation is of an MBA in like 1 year versus an MBA of 2 years?
I think that's a very important question, and a lot of people here would benefit from understanding my rationale and the differences in general, what I have seen for people with similar backgrounds. Broadly, across both India and the globe, as you rightly pointed out, you have the traditional 2-year programs, and maybe less common, the 1-year program, the one that I went to. In fact, mine is a 10-month program, which is even more intense. The purpose would depend on what's your motivation to do an MBA. Mine at a 8 or a 9-year PQE was more about understanding and learning the most I can in a short amount of time and get back to the workforce. And also to have an accelerated exposure to things that made me uncomfortable. Because as lawyers, when you're studying for an MBA and when you're studying during an MBA, it can get challenging as opposed to, let's say, another engineer. Because there are a lot of concepts that we as lawyers actually shy away from. For example, numbers, Excel, PowerPoint, valuations, graphs, things which are part and parcel of an engineer's life or someone with a quant background, but not as much for lawyers. We enjoy our words. We enjoy our MS Word, right? So that motivation for me is also driven from a sense of putting myself in an uncomfortable position because it accelerates the learning, at least for me. And generally also, I have seen that in these 1-year programs like INSEADs, the cohort is usually one that is on the slightly higher end of the work experience. And the reason is exactly similar to what I have stated, that people want an accelerated exposure to the kind of experience that they want, and they want to get to the workforce quickly. So for me, it was fairly easy to identify INSEAD as one of the best options available. But another factor that a lot of people recognize is which geography you want to work in and what's your financial comfort. Now, when I say geography, that has a huge bearing on where you end up doing an MBA from. And what I can generally say, not as a rule, but as a general understanding, people who want to work in the US should only do an MBA from the US. People who want to work in India will be far better off doing an MBA in India for the ROI. People who want a more global experience should focus on schools like INSEAD and maybe LBS to a certain extent, and certain schools in Singapore as well. And then you have the very focused schools, which are either in Canada or in continental Europe or maybe even China, which would effectively be based on that jurisdiction being the one that you want to work in. So it all depends on what your comfort is in terms of where you want to end up. It depends on your financial comfort. US schools are significantly more expensive than most international schools. But the flip side is you also have opportunity for scholarships as well. INSEAD is one year, so it's less intense, but not as, I would say, as cheap, if I can call it that. And then you also have the notion of cohort you want to interact with. And that's again a factor. And that was for me one of the most important factors for choosing INSEAD, because INSEAD is easily one of the most diverse MBA schools in the world, given no single nationality can constitute more than 11 to 12% of the entire batch. So you're bound to interact with people from different nationalities, different backgrounds. That's not the same for US schools, where a majority of the cohort is US. And that's also probably less true to the extent of other international schools like in Europe. So those factors determine where you actually end up and in which career journey you are. Again, last point would be the higher end you are. For me personally, it felt 1 year is good enough. But the earlier you are in your career, let's say 2-3 years out of a job, or even a fresher, maybe you'd consider a 2-year program much better suited for your life. So it's a very, very fluid structure. And